All right, folks, this is the Rich Life Podcast. Today, we are going to go into some relationship stuff that's going to hopefully help you not get into a really bad fight. So, we're taking a page from the Gottman Four Horsemen. And these Four Horsemen are the things to just be aware of in your relationships, of things not to do. Today, we want to focus in on contempt. Paul wrote a great article, which you can find at drpowu.com. I'm sure if you type in the word contempt, this article will come up. But in it, he has a case study of Lisa and Mark. I'll just read a little bit of this. Lisa and Mark have been married for 8 years. Lately, their arguments have escalated from minor disagreements to full-blown fights with sarcasm and defensiveness. Lisa often criticizes Mark for his spending habits, saying, "Wow, must be nice to buy yourself another new gadget while I handle all the responsibilities."
Contempt is oftentimes known as a third of the Four Horsemen in the Gottman ecosphere. And previously, we've done episodes on criticism and defensiveness. We've also touched upon stonewalling on several occasions. But contempt is definitely the most damaging, the most corrosive of the Four Horsemen, according to the Gottman Institute's research. It has by far the strongest predictor of divorce and relationship breakdown. I think the statistics is something along the lines of around 94, 95%. So definitely something to look out for. If there's one thing to be on the lookout for in your relationship, it is this one. And if there is, we'll talk about the antidotes to it and ways that we can keep it to a minimum.
And so Paul mentioned that 95% statistic, and it's not made up. So Gottman will do is they'll creepishly bring people into their Big Brother type of studio. And I don't know exactly how they do it, Paul, but they must have these 4 things and maybe a few others that they have identified, and they just check the box on it, right, when they see it come up. And I think you and your spouse also do this when you hang out with other couples, and just be aware of it, right? It's a fun game for people out there, a twisted game, but
Yeah.
I do see it's cool. Like, we do it too. It's a good way of being aware, practicing the awareness, because awareness is always the first part.
Totally. What the Gottmans did was they studied literally thousands of couples. Like you said, they had clipboards on them. And they also attached heart rate monitors and other sensors to test for the physiological variables that come up when people fight. So they're able to detect when people's fight or flight response gets revved up and when there's actually autonomic changes. But going back to this idea of contempt, oftentimes we talk about it in the context of romantic relationships, and it's certainly probably the most corrosive there. However, it's also very applicable in other types of relationships, whether it is friendships, work dynamics, or even our relationship to ourself, like AKA our self perception. So common examples of contempt, it's things like using sarcasm or using a condescending tone. Right? So I'm sure we've all noticed that in our own lives and our own relationships. And we've also noticed that maybe when we're watching some of our friends or couples have arguments, and sometimes they can lead to some awkward moments, right? Because you can sense when there is contempt just by the way that someone is talking down to their partner. It's things like rolling the eyes, sneering. Maybe it's like the way you carry your body language, like crossing your arms and just looking down on the other person. And in essence, it is worse than criticism, because contempt is a deep-seated feeling of feeling like you're superior over the other person. And when you're on the receiving end of it, it's virtually impossible to have any sort of meaningful dialogue, conversation, or let alone like trying to solve a problem together.
In episode 2, we talked about the first horseman, which is criticism. I know what your thoughts on this, but I feel like contempt is a little bit more of an aged or maybe worse degree of criticism, right? The stinky cheese got even stinkier once it gets to contempt. There are certain things that I do better than my spouse and vice versa. And we know each other's strengths and weaknesses. Sometimes this stuff is unavoidable too, right?
Yeah. It is. I think to your point, like I think you alluded to the fact that this is something that tends to creep in over time, right? I think you said it's like an aged process of criticism. And yeah, this is why it's one that oftentimes sneaks up on you and it becomes gradually more and more prevalent, and you get to this point where all of a sudden there's a lot of contempt, and you realize, oh my gosh, how did we get here? And you mentioned that Lisa would criticize Mark's spending habits, and Mark, obviously, when he hears a comment directed at him with such a tone, he can respond with his own contempt, right? With his own sort of mockery, say, oh yeah, because keeping this household running is so hard compared to what I do, right? So it's that tone, it's that sarcasm. There's disdain and disgust for the other person. And it's just that you just end up in a situation where you're attacking each other rather than addressing the real issue. And this leads to festering resentment and a growing disconnection when this goes on.
And this is like super sad because when it gets to that level, there really isn't too much either can do at this point unless you have an outside, like a counselor, which I'm a big proponent of doing myself.
Same.
It's so prickly at that point that it's really hard for anybody to come back from. And
Yeah,
it truly is. When you do hear it in other people, you already know where things are heading. The momentum is already there. And
yes,
despite everybody's best efforts, it's very hard to come back from that.
correct. This is a good segue into what can you do if you find yourself in a situation like Lisa and Mark, and let's face it, especially those of us who have been in long-term relationships or have been married for a while, I'd venture to say that most, if not all of us, have encountered these scenarios. So one of the antidotes for contempt is replacing the contemptuous statements with I feel and I need statements. Right? So instead of saying, you never listen to me, you're effing selfish, right? So reframe that into, right, I feel unheard when I share something and it gets dismissed. I need us to create space to listen to each other without interruptions.
None of this, I feel like,
You can't just put I feel before you say you. Cut out
that's a
the
foul.
cut it. That doesn't cut it. It really has to be I feel blank emotion when there's a certain situation, or I need something, insert something specific. So that's something to do in the moment. Probably one of the few things you could do when contempt springs up. But like we were talking about before, because contempt is usually something that builds up over time, oftentimes the antidote is not going to be like a quick fix. Right? So the real longer lasting antidote to contempt is building a culture of appreciation. Right? And that is not something that happens overnight. That's a daily, like a weekly practice. And almost, I would argue that you actually need to really be intentional about this and actually carve out time to do this. Right?
They call this the putting like the social currency piggy bank or the relationship piggy bank. And going back to my analogy of no scar tissue, a lot of scar tissue on a knee where there's no cartilage. In a way, the cartilage is like that cushion or padding, just like if you have a positive balance in each other's heart piggy banks. If you already see the contempt and you have acknowledgement from both sides, I think you got to get professional help at this point. It's just hard once you get to this point. Right? You're already grinding the bone.
Yes, I agree. Had my wife and I not gone through couples therapy with the whole Gottman approach, I don't think we would have been aware of this and the importance of actually taking time out each week to really build that, like you said, social currency, to build that culture of appreciation. When you don't have the awareness, it's natural to just spiral downwards, right? Because you don't really know how to get out of it, right? You're in a tailspin. So at the very least, get a coach, get a counselor, get a therapist who's really well trained in this stuff, and then learn the tools. And then later on, you'll be able to implement this on your own much better. Most, if not all of us, have little to no training, little to no role models in terms of relationships, healthy relationships. Right? Most of us don't have great role models for that. And it's not something they teach in school. This is an area where I highly recommend investing in someone like a relationship coach or a therapist.
But that's the hard part is you might have one person who listens to this podcast and is, yeah, you know what, they do that and I do that too. But you need the second person to buy in too, to be like, yeah, I do that too. And I'm willing to get vulnerable and talk to a professional or talk to somebody. And that's, I don't know, damn near little to no chance. I don't know, man. I've talked to somebody about this, and this is a real life story. I think she was the leader in this, and she just put it out there. She's like, "Look, read this book, or maybe in this case, hey, listen to this. I think
Mhm.
it'll be 20 minutes long. If you feel like we both have these things, these two dudes said go seek professional help." Anyway, she told the guy, her husband, "Look, if you think that this is us, I'm made an appointment at this time and this time. I'll see you there." Hopefully it works. But that was just one real life story that I heard from another person, and it worked. And you know what? They both started to get educated in this stuff as you did, and they started to become aware of it, and now made a little more into a fun game in a way. And then they're off and rolling. Now they're building muscle.
That's awesome.
But that's the sad thing is when you might, person listening right now, you might be nodding your head, but having the other person jump on, especially when things get rough. And I think maybe that's some of the understanding I think you need to have too, that the other person is in pain, there's scar
Yeah.
tissue. They may not want to do what makes obvious sense.
And I was that reluctant spouse in the beginning.
You were the guy.
I
Look
was the
at
guy.
you now.
Yeah, I was the guy that like, I'm just going through the motions. I'm just gonna show up and just say, all right, do my part. If worked, it failed.
Do you remember what was it that you're just like, I'm just gonna give this a shot? How did you talk yourself into at least going through the motions? That's better than nothing.
I remember why I didn't want to go because naturally I thought, a smart guy, I already have all the answers. I don't need nobody telling me.
It costs money, right?
It costs money. What are we doing? Not getting anything tangible.
The number one thing that leads to your happiness or just something that ruins your weekend is this stuff. If you're not in a halfway decent to neutral place, I spend money to go to a nice dinner, a few $100. I would gladly spend double the amount of money to not have a big fight or
Oh,
total big fight, right? That's how I justify it in my head.
Nowadays, I truly believe that, as Esther Perel said, the quality of our relationships determines the quality of our lives. And that's how important it is. You can have all the material wealth in the world, but if your primary relationships are not sound, then I'm sorry, it's not a happy life. It's not a rich life.
Might not be everybody, but most people.
Yeah. And going back to this topic of contempt, I think the other reason that it's probably the worst of the Four Horsemen is that they've done studies looking at this, and they found that it's not just very toxic emotionally, but it also has physical effects. So couples who have very high levels of contempt, they're far more likely to have weakened immune systems. As a result, they get sick more often, and they have just overall higher levels of stress and like lowered life expectancy. In the workplace, contempt, it's inevitably going to lead to workplace toxicity, burnout, disengagement, and just a complete lack of collaboration. So it's really far reaching consequences. So this is definitely something to look out for.
To give people another idea, I'm looking at your article here. You have the 5-to-1 ratio of
Mhm.
appreciation tactic, where you have to be mindful, and does get a mechanical doing this, but you try to be conscious of, for every one so-called criticism thing or negative things, you do 5 good things.
Yeah.
I will say that I've been aware of this, but I've never found a way for this thing to work for myself, though. So again, a lot of these things are just ideas, but it may not work for you.
It's really hard. Our brains are designed to protect us, to keep us from harm. Our brains aren't designed to keep us happy and fulfilled. This is why negative sentiments, we hold on to those much more tightly than positive sentiments. We tend to remember the negative comments that people make to us far more than any sort of positive feedback that you get. The best estimate is that you need like a 5-to-1 ratio of positive thoughts or emotions for every one negative one. That's where they came up with the 5-to-1 ratio. And it's one thing that my wife and I, we've implemented is weekly, like we do this on Saturday nights where we do something called like a State of the Union. It starts off with each of us, we take turns and list 5 things that we appreciated about each other throughout the week. 5 things. And sometimes it's easy to list off 5 things. Sometimes it's not, especially if we've had a tough week. Recall like the positive things about the other partner. But oftentimes like there's this like initial resistance that you got to get through. But
I mean, it
once,
could come across as like sarcasm, right? Especially when you're coming from a place of pain.
yes.
But I would maybe urge people to make it come from a place of, oh, at least this fucking guy is trying for us. Right? He's doing a horrible job, somewhat coming across as like negative. But at least this dude is trying, for
Yeah.
goodness sake. And in a way, you are fighting for your life here, fighting for your relationship.
Yeah, sometimes I've seen some folks do this exercise and it's sometimes all you can reach, right? Like the low hanging fruit. Thank you for taking into the trash today.
Do you ever, I know you work with people on an individual basis, but do you ever bring both the spouse in, or do things like this, or?
So I recommend, go seek out like a formally trained couples counselor or couples therapist. But these tools, I like to give out like a bunch of handouts that I give out, things that people can do on a day-to-day basis, and just building awareness that these tools do exist.
Yeah, it's also, I would say maybe even reach out to Paul, because sometimes you hear about this stuff on a podcast like this, but maybe it's just a little bit of reassurance talking to somebody about it and knowing that behind closed doors, everybody does these four things.
Yeah. It's just because you do these four things doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. In fact, it's completely normal. Even healthy couples, they go through the Four Horsemen. I think the difference between healthy couples and unhealthy couples is that healthy couples, when they go through one or more of the horsemen, they recognize it much more quickly, and then they take steps to repair it than the actual fight or disagreement itself. And oftentimes it's the repair that makes or breaks you. It's the repair or lack of repair that determines whether or not your relationship actually gets stronger, or does it die like a slow death.
If you guys are interested in these topics, you can specifically go back to podcast number 2, which is criticism, and podcast number 20, which is defensivism. But if you're also keen to the YouTube system, we've been putting these relationship spouse episodes and categorizing them for you. I've been doing that for all of you guys. So if you go to the YouTube channel and you go to our channel and then you look for the relationship ones. But any last thoughts on this one, Paul?
Just that we all go through this. If you do, it's normal, right? These are very human problems, universal human issues that we're here to support one another and to grow. Hopefully this episode brought about some awareness. Next time you catch yourself or your partner in this sort of cycle, you'll be able to catch it a little bit more easily and realize that there's steps to correct it and actually make your relationship stronger.
My spouse and I have read the books and done some workshops, but nothing really replaces the in-person workshop or a counseling session one-on-one. We just did one of these things 2 or 3 weekends ago, and it's just so much more effective. Like, don't get me wrong, keep listening to this podcast because I think it's good value since you don't spend any money on this, but I think nothing replaces the in-person stuff on this. Because, I'm always surprised. Like, people have never heard of Gottman or Gary Chapman. Definitely one of those things that want to get the word out on.
Yeah, for sure. And since so many of our listeners are into things like financial literacy, investing, financial health, need we remind people that probably the biggest financial wealth killer is divorce. We talk about asset protection all the time.
So if a divorce means minus $1 million to you, and going on one session can prevent it by 1%, that's $1,000 or 10 grand.
That's pretty good ROI. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'll see you guys next time.
All right. See you guys.